Out at the Mediterranean dusk, 3 Italian battleships opened fire. Orange flashes, then the scream of shells falling from beyond the curve of the horizon, 30,000 meters away. In the middle of the pounding, British Rear Admiral Philip Vian could only stand and watch from the bridge of the Dido-class light cruiser HMS Naiad. His orders were simple. It was December 17, 1941, and his convoy was to deliver the fuel tank of Breconshire to the island of Malta at all costs. There was just one little problem. Vian's warships carried 5.25-inch and 6-inch guns. They might be enough to damage a destroyer, possibly threaten a light cruiser, and maybe annoy a heavy cruiser, but they would be utterly pathetic against battleship armor at any meaningful range. And so, minutes from annihilation, Vian just went for it. He pulled out the one weapon, the one move that had zero chance of actually working, except it happened to be the one single thing the Italians were genuinely afraid of. By December 1941, Malta was slowly weakening. The island, which had been called by some an indestructible aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, had become a trap for its inhabitants and defenders. Food supplies were almost gone, and there was only enough aviation fuel for a few more flights. In Valletta's underground shelters, everyone, civilians and soldiers alike, waited to see how long it would be before they had to give up. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, leading the Mediterranean fleet from Alexandria, was in an impossible position. Each convoy to Malta meant putting precious warships at risk of being sunk by the Luftwaffe, lurking submarines, or fast surface raiders. But without those supplies, Malta would fall, and with it, any chance of disrupting Rommel's vital supply lines to North Africa. The entire North African campaign hung in the balance. The loading of HMS Breconshire at Alexandria carried the weight of this desperate situation. Into her holds went around 9,000 tons of fuel oil, aviation gasoline, and kerosene. Every gallon had been calculated against Malta's burn rate. Ammunition, spare parts for hurricanes and Wellingtons, medical supplies, preserved food. The manifest read like the inventory of a civilization's last stand. Rear Admiral Philip Vian received his orders with characteristic fortitude. His Force B would escort Breconshire through the shooting gallery of the central Mediterranean. The Admiral studied his assets, the light cruisers HMS Naiad, HMS Carlisle, and his flagship HMS Euryalus. 8 destroyers would form the screen. It was a respectable escort by peacetime standards. By December 1941 standards, after the Mediterranean fleet's recent catastrophes, it was desperately thin. 3 weeks earlier, U-331 had put 3 torpedoes into HMS Barham. 862 men had perished when the battleship's magazines detonated. Days before Breconshire's departure, HMS Galatea was torpedoed on night patrol, taking 470 sailors to the bottom. The Mediterranean had become a graveyard for British capital ships. Vian had no illusions about his tactical position. His cruisers mounted 5.25-inch and 6-inch guns, okay for destroyer actions and convoy defense, hopeless against battleships. He had no air cover once beyond fighter range from Egypt. He had no battleship support. None were available. His orders were terrible and straightforward. Get Breconshire through to Malta, whatever the cost. British intelligence provided fragments of concern. Aerial reconnaissance showed unusual activity in Italian ports. Radio intercepts suggested major fleet movements. Vian could only prepare for the worst while hoping for manageable opposition. Perhaps Italian cruisers, at most a single old battleship. This hope would prove catastrophically optimistic. In Taranto and Naples, a naval colossus was stirring to life. Admiral Angelo Iachino, still haunted by the disaster at Cape Matapan 9 months earlier, supervised the assembly of an overwhelming force. This time, there would be no surprises. This time, the Regia Marina would sail with enough firepower to obliterate any conceivable British threat. The battleship Littorio led the armada, 35,000 tons of armor and guns, the pride of Mussolini's navy. Her 9 15-inch rifles could throw a 1,900-pound shell over 42 kilometers. Beside her steamed the modernized dreadnoughts Andrea Doria and Giulio Cesare, veterans of the Great War, rebuilt for modern combat. 3 battleships might have sufficed. The heavy cruisers Gorizia and Trento added their 8-inch batteries to the overwhelming firepower. 3 light cruisers of the 7th Division, Duca d'Aosta, Attendolo, and Montecuccoli, provided close escort. 10 destroyers darted between the capital ships like lethal shepherds. The math was absurd. Nearly 100,000 tons of warships to escort 20,000 tons of merchant vessels. 4 supply ships, the German Ankara, bound for Benghazi. 3 Italian vessels headed for Tripoli, warranted this massive protection. GBI Iachino's overwhelming response was rooted in faulty intelligence. German reconnaissance aircraft had been shadowing British movements for days. Their reports, transmitted to Supermarina and filtered through layers of command, had transformed in the telling. A large tanker became a battleship. Destroyer formation suggested hidden capital ships. Most crucially, Luftwaffe pilots had repeatedly misidentified Breconshires bulk as a battleship silhouette. The error would cascade through Italian planning. Iachino was to assume that at least one British battleship was at sea. He was to be prepared for a possible squadron from Alexandria. He was to remember that Cunningham had hidden battleships before. At Matapan, they had appeared from nowhere to annihilate Italian cruisers at point-blank range. The aggressive British attacks and superior night-fighting capabilities had led to catastrophe. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers were sunk. Over 2,300 Italian sailors were lost. The admiral had been criticized for his caution, then blamed for his boldness. Now he would sail with overwhelming force, but absolute prudence. No night battles, no pursuits into possible ambushes. Protect the convoy at all costs, but preserve the battle fleet above all. The Italian battle fleet that sortied on December 16th represented the Regia Marina's maximum available strength. Only the damaged Vittorio Veneto, torpedoed by HMS Urge 2 days earlier, remained in port. Everything else that could sail was at sea. As the massive formation passed through the Strait of Messina, it presented a sight not seen since Jutland, a battle line capable of dominating any surface engagement. The 2 convoys traced paths across the winter Mediterranean like pawns advancing, but neither side possessed a clear picture of what they faced. The fog of war was thick. British intelligence had provided Admiral Vian with dangerous half-truths. Ultra-intercepts confirmed that an Italian convoy was at sea. Aerial reconnaissance spotted naval movements, but their scale was hidden. The British, having bloodied the Regia Marina repeatedly in recent weeks, assumed Italian morale was shattered. Vian planned accordingly. His operational assumptions envisioned perhaps encountering the old battleship Calo Duilio, possibly some cruisers, certainly destroyers. His 3 light cruisers, reinforced by Force K from Malta, could handle such opposition through aggressive tactics and the superior seamanship of the Royal Navy. The British had defeated odds before. Speed, smoke, and audacity could overcome firepower disparities. These assumptions would send Vian sailing directly into the guns of 3 battleships. At the same time, Italian intelligence was building its own web of lies. The phantom British battleships, first reported by Luftwaffe reconnaissance, had taken on a life of their own in the Supermarina's analysis. Every vague contact was seen as potential proof of capital ships. The British had 2 battleships at Alexandria. Surely Cunningham would use them to protect such an important convoy. Admiral Iachino absorbed these warnings and added his own interpretations. The British were too aggressive, too confident. Such confidence suggested hidden strength. Light cruisers would only challenge the Italian fleet if battleships lurked behind them. The British had radar. They could coordinate night attacks, but Iachino's ships couldn't detect them until it was too late. He had to carefully calculate even the smallest maneuver if he was to outwit the British. The afternoon of December 17th saw both forces maneuvering toward each other in accordance with their assumptions. Axis reconnaissance aircraft had found Vian's convoy around noon, reporting its position and composition, though still insisting a battleship was present. The British convoy, tracked by relays of bombers, could not hide its westward progress toward Malta. German Ju-88s and Italian SM-79s began harassment attacks in the afternoon. They achieved no hits, but their presence confirmed what both admirals knew. Contact was imminent. The attacks served another purpose. They forced the British ships to reveal their positions through anti-aircraft fire, providing bearings for the approaching Italian fleet. At 4 p.m., Force K rendezvoused with Vlan's escort, the light cruisers Aurora and Penelope, with 2 destroyers under Captain Agnew. The combined escort now numbered 5 light cruisers and 12 destroyers. To Vlan, this seemed adequate strength. To the Italians, watching through reconnaissance reports, it suggested the British were massing for battle. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, both admirals issued final orders. Vlan, protect Breconshire at all costs. Avoid decisive engagement if possible. Use the coming darkness for escape. Iachino, cover the convoy. Engage enemy surface forces if encountered under favorable conditions, and avoid night combat. Both sets of orders emphasized convoy protection over seeking battle. The 2 forces were less than 50 miles apart in closing. At 5:41 p.m., the Mediterranean erupted. The Italian battle line had acquired visual contact minutes earlier. Distant masts and smoke on the southwestern horizon. Range, approximately 32,000 meters. Littorio's fire control officers made their calculations. Wind speed, visibility, target bearing, and target speed. The massive 15-inch guns were elevated and trained. Admiral Iachino gave the order. The initial volleys thundered across the sea as dusk approached. 9 massive 1,900-pound shells ascended to a great height, even above the clouds, before plunging upon the British vessels. 40 seconds later, they hit. British lookouts first observed the brilliant orange muzzle flashes on the horizon, followed by the dreadful freight train-like roar as the shells drew nearer. The salvo straddled HMS Euryalus. Towers of water erupted around the light cruiser, each spout climbing higher than her mastheads. The concussion knocked men from their feet. Splinters whined through the air. But there were no direct hits, not yet. Andrea Doria and Giulia Cesare added their voices to the barrage. Now, 27 heavy guns were firing, their shells falling like sledgehammers around the British ships. Admiral Vlan's position was impossible. His 5.25-inch and 6-inch guns had a maximum effective range of 20,000 meters. The Italians were shooting from 30,000. He couldn't respond, couldn't even threaten a response. His ships were being used as target practice by an enemy he couldn't reach. The only option was to dodge, weave, and pray. Then, an order flew through the British formation, quote, "Make smoke." Destroyers began laying thick screens of chemical smoke, building walls of gray-black fog between the convoy and the Italian guns. But the smoke took time to form, and the Italian salvos came every 20 seconds. Each pattern of splashes walked closer to the British ships, as Italian fire control found the range. HMS Kipling nearly plunged at 5:47 p.m. An Italian shell detonated just off her port side. The explosion was massive. Shrapnel tore through Kipling's thin armor, destroying her radio aerials, punching holes through her hull, and wounding 15 men. 1 young midshipman was lost instantly, the first of the engagement. Kipling staggered, but maintained speed, as damage control parties raced to plug the holes. The Australian destroyer HMS Naiad took splinter damage moments later. Near misses shook every ship in the formation. Aboard Naiad, Admiral Vlan watched the shell splashes marching closer with each salvo. His gunnery officer reported, quote, "We're out of range, sir. Can't return fire effectively." The men could only watch the incoming fire, feel their ships buck and shake from near misses, and endure. Some destroyers fired back anyway, not expecting to hit anything at such range, but needing to do something, anything, rather than simply take punishment. Amidst it all, the smokescreens just kept getting thicker. The British had practiced this maneuver time and time again, destroyers weaving in and out of their own smoke, laying down fresh banks as old ones faded, slowly building a massive wall between the enemy and the convoy. It was their only defense against the superiority of Italian guns, and they pulled it off with desperate perfection. By 5:55 p.m., gun flashes lit up the horizon like distant lightning. Shells erupted everywhere, their impacts lost in clouds of smoke. The Italians fired by guesswork, aiming at the smoke clouds themselves, hoping for some lucky hits. thunder of guns seemed to go on forever, yet it lasted barely 15 minutes. Vian made his decision at 6:05 p.m. The convoy couldn't endure this punishment indefinitely. A lucky Italian shell would eventually find its mark. The smokescreens offered concealment, but not protection. Something had to break the deadlock before full darkness, still at least 30 minutes away. He would have to gamble everything on a bluff. He gave his orders, quote, "All destroyers prepare for torpedo attack on enemy battle line." From within the smokescreens, destroyer captains began their preparations. This was the Royal Navy's signature move. The decisive torpedo charge that had won victories from the Spanish Armada to Jutland. At 6:15 p.m., they emerged from the smoke. HMS Jervis led, followed by Hasty, Havoc, Hero, and Hereward. 5 destroyers raced at maximum speed directly toward the Italian battle line. Behind them, other destroyers continued laying smoke, while the cruisers maneuvered as if preparing to support a major attack. To Italian lookouts, it appeared the entire British force was surging forward for a mass torpedo assault. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Italian lookouts reported torpedo tracks in the water. Whether these were real or imagined remains unclear. Some British destroyers may have launched torpedoes for effect, though none would score hits at such extreme range. What mattered was the perceived threat. Admiral Iachino stood on Lutario's flag bridge, processing the sudden reversal. British destroyers were charging his battle line. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing certain destruction, yet they attacked. No rational commander would throw away destroyers unless they were screening something larger. Unless British battleships were hidden in that smoke, preparing their own attack. The ghost of Cape Matapan materialized in Iachino's mind. Reluctantly, he ordered, quote, "Turn away. All ships turn to port. Cease firing." The Italian battle line began to turn at 6:20 p.m. 3 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, the most powerful service force in the Mediterranean, were withdrawing from 5 British destroyers and 3 light cruisers. The destroyers pressed their mock attack for several more minutes, watching in amazement as the Italian giants turned away, their gun flashes ceasing, their massive silhouettes fading into the gathering darkness. Commander Graham, aboard HMS Jervis, later described the moment, quote, "We couldn't believe it. We were charging battleships with nothing but bluff and smoke, fully expecting to be blown out of the water. Then they turned away. Just turned away." The Italian withdrawal was disciplined, not panicked. Iachino reformed his battle line on a northwesterly course, maintaining formation, ready to respond if British heavy units appeared. But no British battleships emerged from the smoke, because none existed. The phantom threat that had shaped Italian planning all day had saved Vian's convoy at the crucial moment. By 6:30 p.m., the engagement was effectively over. Darkness was falling. The Italian fleet had disappeared into the night. Even though no ships were lost on either side, the First Battle of Sirte, lasting under an hour, had a considerable impact on the Mediterranean campaign. The British, still recovering from the shock of their survival, regrouped around Breconshire and pressed on towards Malta. The immediate aftermath of First Sirte seemed to validate both admirals' decisions. Each had accomplished his primary mission, protecting their respective convoy. But within 48 hours, the true cost of the engagement would become catastrophically clear for the Royal Navy. HMS Breconshire reached Grand Harbor, Malta, at 3 p.m. on December 18th. Her arrival sparked celebration on the besieged island. 9,000 tons of fuel and supplies had made it through, enough to keep Malta fighting for several more weeks. Admiral Vian, having detached 2 destroyers as close escort, reversed course with his main force back toward Alexandria. His aggressive defense had worked. David had faced Goliath and survived. The Italian convoy M42 had likewise reached its destination safely. 3 merchantmen made Tripoli. The German ship Ankara reached Benghazi. Rommel's Africa Corps received desperately needed fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. The supply line to North Africa severed for weeks by British naval and air attacks, had been reopened. From the Italian perspective, the operation was an unqualified success. British intelligence recognized the full scope of what had occurred too late. An entire Italian battle fleet was covering a major convoy operation. That convoy was now delivering supplies to Axis forces in Libya. The Royal Navy couldn't allow the success to stand. Orders went out to Malta's strike forces: find and destroy the Italian convoy on its return journey. At 6 p.m. on the 18th, a British squadron departed from Malta. Force K, the veteran cruisers Aurora and Penelope, joined with Force B, led by the cruiser Neptune. 7 ships total, including destroyers, headed into the night to intercept the Italian merchantmen approaching Tripoli. It was an aggressive but necessary move. At 1 a.m. on December 19th, disaster struck. The British squadron, racing through the darkness off Tripoli, hit an Italian minefield. Field T had been laid recently, its position unknown to British intelligence. HMS Neptune hit the first mine. The explosion disabled her propellers, leaving her helpless. As Captain O'Connor attempted to back his ship out, Neptune struck 3 more mines in quick succession. The 4th detonation was catastrophic. The cruiser capsized immediately, taking all but 1 of her 767 crew to the bottom, the largest single loss of life for the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean War. HMS Kandahar, moving to assist Neptune, struck another mine. Her stern was blown off. Aurora and Penelope, maneuvering to avoid the minefield, each hit mines as well. Aurora's bow was torn open. Penelope's hull was riddled with holes. Both cruisers limped back to Malta. Kandahar had to be scuttled the next day when salvage proved impossible. In minutes, the Malta strike force had been effectively destroyed. 1 cruiser sunk, 2 crippled, 1 destroyer lost. As if choreographed, on the same night of December 18th, Italian special forces delivered another strategic blow. The submarine Skirre had penetrated Alexandria harbor, launching 3 manned torpedoes. Italian frogmen attached limpet mines to the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, the last British capital ships in the eastern Mediterranean. At dawn, both battleships were resting on the harbor bottom, their hulls breached, out of action for months. The strategic aftermath was devastating. In late November, the Mediterranean fleet had at its disposal battleships, a carrier, and multiple cruiser squadrons. By December 19th, it had no operational battleships, no carriers, and Malta's strike force had been eliminated. The First Battle of Sirte holds a strange place in history. Tactically inconclusive, yet strategically pivotal. The ammunition expended achieved minimal damage. By traditional metrics of naval victory, enemies sunk or captured, it was barely a battle at all. Yet it fundamentally altered the Mediterranean campaign. Admiral Vian had demonstrated that inferior forces could survive against overwhelming odds through aggressive tactics and psychological warfare. His use of smokescreens and destroyer charges would become the template for future convoy battles. 3 months later, at the Second Battle of Sirte, Vian would employ identical tactics in daylight, fighting off another Italian battleship attack through 5 hours of continuous combat. Cunningham would call it, quote, one of the most brilliant naval actions of the war. However, that convoy too would ultimately be destroyed by air attack after the naval threat was defeated. For the Italians, Sirte validated their post-Matapan doctrine while highlighting its limitations. Caution had preserved their battle fleet and ensured their convoy's delivery, but that same caution had allowed an inferior British force to escape destruction. Italian naval historian Admiral Bernotti later wrote that Iachino had, quote, won the battle but lost the opportunity. A crushing blow might have shortened Malta's resistance by months. Before December 17, 1941, the Royal Navy had a shaky grip on the central Mediterranean. By December 19th, that control had slipped into Axis hands. Malta would soon face its toughest days in early 1942, and it would be ravaged by starvation before the tide finally turned. Rommel, meanwhile, received steady supplies, which fueled his push toward El Alamein. The battle's inconclusive gunfire exchange had produced thoroughly conclusive strategic results. The last word belongs to those who were there. A survivor from HMS Kipling later recalled, quote, "We knew we were outnumbered, outgunned, completely buggered if they pressed home. But we went at them anyway. That's what you did. And somehow, impossibly, it worked."